The first time he saw her, he didn't really see her at all. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hush as Ethan Caldwell stepped into the restaurant, his presence arriving a full second before his body did, carried by the tailored navy suit, the polished leather shoes, the subtle weight of someone used to being noticed, the kind of man whose time was measured in millions per hour, whose decisions shaped companies he barely had to remember, and yet tonight, like every other Thursday, he took the same corner table without looking up, not at the host, not at the guests, and certainly not at the woman who approached with a steady hand and a notepad already open. Clara Bennett moved like she had learned to disappear on purpose, her black uniform pressed but unremarkable, her hair tied back in a way that asked for no attention, her footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. She placed the water glass exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table, aligned with the knife. Not a millimeter off, not a sound made. Ethan didn't notice, not yet. He was scrolling, scanning numbers, percentages, a deal closing in Chicago, another stalling in Seattle, his world precise, controlled, measured in outcomes, not in people. Sparkling water, he said without lifting his eyes, and she nodded, though he didn't see it. She turned, walked, returned, placed the bottle, poured to the exact line, no spill, no hesitation, gone again before he could register movement. The restaurant moved around him in soft layers of conversation and glass and muted jazz, and she moved within it like a pattern no one tracked, refilling, adjusting, correcting, a fork slightly misaligned, a receipt folded cleaner than before, a napkin smoothed with 2 fingers instead of 1, small things, invisible things, the kind that only mattered if something went wrong, and nothing did, not on her watch. Across the room, a contract slid across a table, a signature delayed by a decimal point miswritten, a small error. Easy to miss, but it didn't reach Ethan, because somewhere between the kitchen door and the back office, Clara paused, glanced once, then reached for a pen, not her pen, a different one, heavier. She corrected the number without hesitation, precise, confident, then set it back exactly where it had been. No one saw, no one except Ethan, who for the first time that evening lifted his eyes, not fully, just a fraction, enough to catch a movement that didn't fit, a waitress correcting a financial figure she shouldn't even understand. His gaze lingered for half a second longer than usual, then dropped back to his phone, but something stayed, a trace, a disruption, the kind that doesn't make noise but refuses to leave. He leaned back slightly, the leather chair adjusting under his weight. And for reasons he couldn't quite name, he looked up. Again, this time a little longer, watching not her, but the space she occupied, the way everything around her seemed, sharper, more deliberate, as if the room bent subtly to her rhythm. He didn't recognize her, not yet, but for the first time, he noticed that he hadn't been looking at all. The second time he looked, he did not mean to. It happened between 2 numbers, between a projected return and a risk adjustment that should have mattered more, but did not, because something about the way she moved had already unsettled the rhythm he trusted. Ethan Caldwell prided himself on patterns, on seeing what others missed, on catching the smallest inconsistency before it became a loss. And yet here was a different kind of inconsistency, one that did not belong in a spreadsheet. Clara Bennett crossed the room again, carrying a tray that never tilted, her wrist steady, her steps measured, but it was not the balance that caught him, it was the timing. She arrived at each table a second before anyone realized they needed her, refilling a glass just as it reached the last sip, replacing a pen just as it ran dry, adjusting a document just before it could be questioned. It was not service. Not in the way he understood it, it was anticipation, precise, calculated, intentional. He set his phone down without realizing it, his attention shifting from numbers to motion, from data to detail. She paused near his table again, not looking at him, not waiting for instruction, just observing the placement of a receipt he had barely noticed sliding toward the edge. She reached, straightened it, and in that brief moment, Ethan saw her handwriting, clean, structured, almost architectural. The kind of script he had seen in internal reports, in executive summaries, in documents prepared by people who understood systems, not by someone taking orders. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in focus. He leaned forward, just enough to catch the faint engraving on the edge of the pen she used, It was not standard issue, not from the restaurant, something older, heavier, engraved with initials too small to read from where he sat. Clara moved away again, already on to the next task, but Ethan did not return to his phone this time. Instead, he watched the space she left behind. The subtle alignment of objects, the quiet corrections that erased mistakes before they existed. It reminded him of something from years ago, a project that had saved his company from a silent failure, a set of recommendations that had come through anonymously, precise, surgical, impossible to ignore. He had approved them without ever meeting the person behind them, without ever asking who had seen what his entire executive team had missed. He exhaled slowly. The memory not fully formed but present enough to linger. Across the room, Clara adjusted her watch, a simple motion, but the sleeve of her uniform shifted just enough to reveal the face. It was not new, not polished, the kind of watch that did not belong in a place like this. But there was something else, a small marking along the inner edge, not decorative, not random, something deliberate, something familiar. Ethan stood, not abruptly, not drawing attention, just enough to change his angle, to see more clearly. The distance between them felt different now, not measured in feet, but in understanding. He was no longer observing a waitress, he was observing a pattern he had not yet solved, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell felt something he did not often allow, curiosity that he could not control. The third time he looked, he did not pretend it was accidental. Ethan Caldwell no longer reached for his phone, no longer checked the time, no longer measured the room by deals and deadlines. Instead he measured it by her. Clara Bennett moved again between tables, but now every motion carried weight, every detail asked a question, and Ethan was finally willing to answer it. He stepped away from his table, slow, deliberate. Not to approach her directly, but to shift his perspective, to see what he had missed from where he had been sitting. The restaurant felt different standing, louder in sound but clearer in pattern, and there it was again, the quiet precision. A guest asked for a modification to an order. Clara nodded once, no hesitation, no note written, and minutes later the dish arrived exactly as requested, not just correct, but improved, adjusted in a way that suggested understanding beyond instruction. Ethan watched the guest's reaction, the slight surprise, the unspoken satisfaction. Then he looked back at Clara, who had already moved on, as if outcomes were expected, not celebrated. He followed. Not close enough to be noticed, but not distant enough to lose sight. She stopped near the service station, reached into her apron, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not a receipt, not an order slip, something thicker, structured. She unfolded it just enough to glance, then folded it again with care. Precise edges, no wasted motion. Ethan's breath slowed. Something about the way she handled that paper felt familiar. Like watching a habit formed in a different environment, one that required discipline, accuracy, consequence. He took another step closer, just enough to catch the corner of the page as it slipped back into her pocket. A glimpse of formatting, bullet points, clean margins, a structure he had seen before, not in restaurants, but in boardrooms, in strategy decks, in proposals that carried weight without needing explanation. His mind moved quickly now, connecting fragments. The corrected number, the handwriting, the timing, the watch, the document, none of it belonged here, and yet it all existed in one person who moved as if none of it needed acknowledgement. Clara turned then, not toward him, but toward the window, adjusting the blinds slightly as the late evening light shifted, and for a brief moment, the reflection in the glass aligned them. Ethan saw himself standing there, still, watching, and her, calm, composed, aware, not surprised, not curious, just present. As if she had already accounted for his attention before he had decided to give it. He stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet, enough to move from observation to intention. Clara turned back toward the room, her eyes passing over him for a fraction of a second, not lingering, not avoiding, just registering, and in that single glance, Ethan felt something shift, not in her, but in himself. The certainty he carried into every room did not apply here. The control he relied on did not extend to this moment, because for the first time, he was not ahead of the situation, he was catching up. He stopped just short of speaking, not because he did not know what to say, but because he realized that whatever he had been about to say would have been wrong, too early, too shallow. Clara moved again, continuing her work, unchanged, unaffected, and Ethan remained where he stood, watching her disappear into the rhythm of the room once more, except now he understood something he had not before. She had never been invisible, he had simply never been paying attention the right way. He did not call her name because he did not know it, and for once, that bothered him more than it should have. Ethan Caldwell stood there longer than a man like him ever stood without purpose, his mind moving through layers of logic, trying to assign explanation where instinct had already decided there was something more. Clara Bennett moved past him again. Close enough this time that he could hear the faint sound of fabric brushing against fabric, the quiet rhythm of someone who did not rush. And did not need to. He turned slightly, enough to follow her path, not enough to interrupt it, and then he saw it clearly, the watch on her wrist, not expensive, not modern, but precise in a way that made it stand out, the face slightly worn, the edges softened by time, but the engraving on the side caught the light for just a second, a small marking, geometric, intentional, not decorative. And something inside him recognized it before his mind did. He stepped closer, not abruptly, just enough to bring it into focus. Clara reached for a glass, lifting it, setting it down, and in that motion the engraving aligned with his memory, a symbol used years ago in one of his company's internal systems, a quiet identifier for a project that had never gone public, a project that had almost failed, until someone unknown had rewritten the structure from the inside out. Ethan felt the shift instantly, not in the room, but in himself, the distance between assumption and realization collapsing in a single breath. He spoke before he could stop himself, his voice controlled, but lower than usual. "Where did you get that watch?" Clara paused, not startled, not defensive, just still for a moment. Then she looked at him fully for the first time, not as a customer, not as a passing figure, but directly, her eyes steady, calm, measuring nothing, revealing nothing. "It was a gift," she said, her voice even, professional, but there was something beneath it, not hesitation, not fear, something like certainty. Ethan studied her face, searching for confirmation, for recognition, for anything that would match the fragments assembling in his mind. "From who?" he asked, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in her expression, not visible to anyone else, but enough for him to notice, a pause measured in less than a second, a decision made quietly. She adjusted the tray in her hand, placing it down with the same precision she applied to everything else. Then she spoke again. "From someone who believed details matter more than titles." The words landed differently than anything else she had said, not because of the content, but because of the way they carried weight without effort. Ethan felt the echo of them somewhere deeper than he expected, his mind reaching back, connecting that phrase to something he had read, something he had approved without fully understanding the mind behind it. Clara did not wait for a response. She turned slightly, already moving back into the flow of the room, as if the conversation had ended before it had fully begun. But Ethan did not move this time. He remained where he stood, the noise of the restaurant fading into something distant. Because for the first time, the pattern was no longer abstract, it was forming into something real, something specific, and he understood now that this was not a coincidence, not a curiosity, but a moment he had not prepared for, the kind of moment that does not ask for permission before it changes the way you see everything that came before it. He did not sit back down right away, not because he had forgotten his table, but because something more important had taken its place. Ethan Caldwell stood in the middle of a room that no longer felt predictable, his thoughts no longer moving in straight lines but circling, revisiting, connecting details he had ignored for years. "Details matter more than titles?" The word stayed with him, not as a phrase, but as a memory he had not realized he still carried. He turned slowly, scanning the room again, not for her this time, but for confirmation, for proof that what he was beginning to understand was real. His table sat untouched, the sparkling water still half full, the contract still waiting, but it all felt distant now, secondary. He reached for his jacket, not to leave, but to retrieve something, his phone. He unlocked it, moved through folders with practiced speed, then stopped at one he had not opened in years. Archived, labeled only by date. He hesitated for a fraction. of a second, then tapped it open. The document appeared instantly, clean, structured, unmistakable, a proposal that had once arrived without a name attached, a solution to a problem no one else had solved. He remembered the moment clearly now, the boardroom, the tension, the risk, and then this document, precise, confident, rewriting the entire approach with clarity that had forced him to approve it. Even without knowing who had written it, he had asked once, briefly, but no one had an answer. The author had remained anonymous, and eventually, he had moved on, as he always did. Results mattered, not origins. But now, standing here, watching the quiet movement of a woman who should not have been connected to any of it, he saw it, the same structure, the same discipline, the same understanding of systems hidden inside small actions. He zoomed in on the document, his eyes scanning the formatting, the spacing, the way information was layered, and then he saw it, a detail so small he had missed it before, a subtle marking in the corner, not a logo, not a signature, but a symbol, the same geometric engraving he had just seen on her watch. His breath slowed, the realization settling not as a shock, but as something deeper, something heavier. He looked up from the screen, his gaze finding her again across the room. Clara Bennett was placing a plate in front of a guest, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. As if nothing had shifted, as if she had not just become the answer to a question he had not known how to ask. Ethan took a step forward, then another, not rushing, not commanding, just moving with intention, the distance between them closing, not in urgency, but in clarity. She turned slightly before he reached her, as if she had sensed the approach, her eyes meeting his. Again, steady, unguarded, not surprised. "You wrote it," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, his voice lower now, stripped of the usual authority, carrying something closer to understanding. Clara did not respond immediately. She finished placing the final detail on the table in front of her, aligning a fork by less than half an inch. Then she straightened, facing him fully, the noise of the room fading again in the space between them. "You approved it," she replied, her tone even, almost gentle, and in that moment, Ethan realized something he had not considered before. The power he believed he held had never been complete, because he had only ever seen part of the equation, the visible part, the titled part, and now, standing in front of someone who had shaped his success without ever being seen, he understood that recognition was not about position, it was about perception. And his had been incomplete. The space between them did not feel like a customer and a server anymore, it felt like a gap in time, 5 years wide, filled with decisions made without names attached. Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately after her words, not because he did not have something to say, but because for the first time, he understood that speaking too quickly would mean missing something again. Clara Bennett did not move away. But she did not step closer either, she simply stood there, balanced, composed, as if this moment had already happened in her mind long before it reached his. The noise of the restaurant continued around them, plates moving, conversations rising and falling, but it no longer reached either of them. "Why did you leave?" he asked finally, the question quieter than anything he had asked in years, stripped of authority, stripped of expectation, just a question. Clara's gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if she was measuring how much of the answer belonged here, in this room, in this moment. "I did not leave," she said, her voice steady. "I just stopped being seen." The words landed without weight, but they carried more than anything else she could have said. Ethan felt them settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere closer to recognition. He exhaled slowly, his mind moving back through the years, through promotions, acquisitions, expansions, moments he had believed were built on his decisions, his leadership, his vision, and now, standing in front of her, he saw the missing layer, the one that had never asked for credit, never required acknowledgement, but had been there all along. "You could have stayed," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement he was trying to understand. Clara's expression did not change, but there was a softness in her eyes now, not emotional, not vulnerable, just present. "Stayed where?" she replied, and for a moment, Ethan had no answer, because he realized that the place he was referring to, the place of recognition, of title, of visibility, was something he had defined, not something she had chosen. He looked around the restaurant again. But this time he saw it differently, not as a setting, not as a backdrop, but as a system, one that required precision, timing, awareness, the same elements that had defined the work she had done before, just applied in a different space. "You are still doing it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Clara gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. "The environment changes," she said. "The work does not." Ethan let that settle, the simplicity of it, the clarity, the absence of any need to prove something, and in that moment, he understood something that had never been part of his calculations. Value did not depend on where it was placed, it existed regardless of recognition, regardless of title, regardless of whether someone like him chose to see it or not. He looked at her again. Fully this time, not as a puzzle to solve, not as a pattern to analyze, but as a person he had overlooked, and for the first time, there was no distance left to close, not physically, but perceptually. "Clara," he said, testing the name as if it mattered more than any title he had ever used, and she responded with the same calm acknowledgement she had given to every table, every detail, every moment, but this time, he understood it was not habit, it was choice, and that realization changed everything. He had said her name, and something about that changed the air between them, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that Ethan Caldwell felt it, the shift from observation to acknowledgement, from distance to presence. Clara Bennett did not react the way most people did when he spoke to them directly. There was no adjustment in posture, no flicker of surprise, no attempt to impress or retreat. She simply accepted it, as she accepted everything else, calmly, precisely, without attaching more meaning than necessary, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because he was used to reactions, used to the subtle recalibration people made when they realized who he was. But Clara did not recalibrate, she remained exactly where she had always been. And for the first time, Ethan understood that it was he who had moved, not her. He glanced back at his table briefly, then returned his attention to her, not because he had decided to, but because he no longer had the option not to. "You knew," he said, his voice lower, more measured, not accusing, but searching. Clara tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question without rushing to answer it. "I recognized the name," she said, and there was no emphasis, no weight placed on it, just a simple truth. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when a realization confirms itself fully. "And you said nothing?" he added, this time not as a question, but as something he was trying to understand from her perspective. Clara's gaze held his, steady, grounded. "What would I have said?" she replied, and again, he had no immediate answer, because the expectation behind his question belonged to a version of the world where recognition required response, where past connections demanded acknowledgement, but she had not operated within that framework. She had operated within something quieter, something more contained. Ethan ran a hand lightly along the edge of the table beside him, grounding himself in the present moment. "You changed the outcome," he said, referring not just to the document from years ago, but to everything that had followed from it. Clara's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes softened slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity. "I adjusted a detail," she said, and the simplicity of that statement landed harder than anything else, because Ethan understood now that what he had considered a defining success had, to her, been a correction, not a creation, a refinement, not a reinvention. He looked at her more carefully, seeing not just the composure, but the intention behind it, the choice to remain where she was, to continue working in a space where her abilities did not demand recognition. "You could do more," he said, the words coming from instinct, from habit, from a lifetime of identifying potential and placing it into larger systems. Clara did not respond immediately. She picked up a glass from a nearby table, wiped a nearly invisible mark from its surface, then set it back down with exact alignment. Only then did she look at him again. "More of what?" she asked, and the question was not dismissive, not challenging. It was genuine, and that made it more difficult to answer, because Ethan realized that the definition of more he had always used did not necessarily apply here. He paused, longer this time, allowing the silence to exist without filling it, and in that silence, something became clear to him that had not been before. Clara Bennett was not a missed opportunity, she was a different kind of choice. One that did not require expansion, only precision, and for the first time, Ethan Caldwell did not try to change that. He simply stood there, seeing her fully, without trying to move her into a space that made sense to him, and that was a shift he had not expected to make. The question stayed between them longer than either of them tried to move it, not because it demanded an answer, but because it revealed something neither of them needed to rush. Ethan Caldwell did not fill the silence this time, he let it exist, let it stretch just enough to feel its weight, and in that space, the restaurant returned slowly, the low hum of conversations, the soft clink of glasses. The quiet rhythm Clara Bennett had been part of long before he noticed her. She turned slightly. Not away from him, but back toward her work, as if the moment had already reached its natural conclusion, and perhaps it had. She picked up a small notepad from the service station, flipping it open with the same precision she applied to everything else, scanning a list that only she seemed to fully understand, then moving again. 1 step, 2 steps, back into motion. Ethan watched her go, not with urgency, not with the instinct to stop her, but with something steadier, something closer to acceptance. He followed at a distance, not to interrupt, but to observe one more time, to confirm what he now understood differently. She approached a table near the window, a couple seated there mid-conversation, their voices low, their attention elsewhere. Clara placed a glass of water down gently, adjusted the angle of a plate by less than an inch, then stepped back, and in that small sequence, Ethan saw it again, the same structure, the same clarity. The same invisible correction that made everything around her function better without drawing attention to itself. It was not less than what she had done before, it was the same work, expressed in a different system. He stopped walking, letting the distance remain, because for the first time, he did not feel the need to close it. Clara finished at the table and turned, her path naturally bringing her back toward him, but this time, when their eyes met, there was no question left in his, only understanding. "You are right," he said quietly, the words simple, unadorned. Clara paused just long enough to acknowledge them, not with surprise, not with validation, but with a calm recognition that he had arrived at something on his own. "About what?" she asked, and there was no challenge in it, only space for him to define it clearly. Ethan glanced briefly around the room, then back at her. "The environment changes," he said, repeating her words, but this time with a different weight. "The work does not." Clara held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest nod, not as agreement, but as confirmation that he had understood it correctly, and in that exchange, something settled between them, not a resolution, not an ending, but a clarity that did not need to be extended further. She moved again, continuing her shift, continuing the quiet precision that had always defined her, and Ethan did not follow this time. He returned to his table, not because he had forgotten it, but because he saw it differently now. He sat down, picking up the contract he had been reviewing earlier, the numbers still there, the structure still sound, but his perspective no longer the same. He noticed things he had not before, small adjustments, potential refinements, details that could be aligned more precisely, and without thinking, he reached for the pen beside him, making a correction, subtle, exact, almost instinctive. He paused, then allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, because he recognized the pattern now, not just in her, but in the way he had begun to think again, differently, more carefully, as if something had been recalibrated without force, without instruction, just through observation. Across the room, Clara continued moving, unchanged, and for the first time, Ethan Caldwell did not see her as someone who needed to be brought into his world. He saw that she had already influenced it, long before he had decided to look closer. By the time the check arrived, nothing in the room had changed, and yet everything had. Ethan Caldwell sat in the same chair, at the same table, holding the same pen, but the way he occupied the space was different, quieter, more deliberate. He reviewed the final line of the contract one last time, not rushing, not assuming, just seeing, really seeing, the alignment of numbers, the balance of terms, the subtle gaps that had once escaped his attention, and with a small, precise motion, he made one last adjustment, not because it would change everything, but because it made it correct, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. He placed the pen down carefully, parallel to the edge of the table, an unconscious echo of something he had observed, then leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting across the room without searching, without needing to find anything specific. Clara Bennett moved through the final stretch of her shift. Unchanged, consistent, finishing what she had started hours ago with the same level of attention she had given the first task. There was no performance in it, no moment where she slowed down to reflect or sped up to finish, just continuity. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, not as a puzzle, not as a missed opportunity, but as a presence he now understood without needing to define. He reached for the bill folder as it was placed gently on the table, opened it, glanced at the total, then paused, not because of the number, but because of what came next. For years, his decisions had been immediate, efficient, executed without hesitation, but this time, he took a second, just one, to consider what mattered in this moment. He wrote the tip, not excessive, not performative, just intentional, aligned with the same precision he had come to recognize, then closed the folder and stood, adjusting his jacket slightly, not out of habit, but out of awareness. He did not look around for her, did not call her name, did not try to extend the moment beyond what it was. Instead, he walked toward the exit, each step measured, grounded, the glass doors ahead reflecting the room behind him, and for a brief second, he saw it all at once, the tables, the lights, the movement, and her, still working, still precise, still unseen by most, but no longer unseen by him. He pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool evening air, the city stretching out in front of him, familiar, structured, but now carrying a different weight. He paused on the sidewalk, not to check his phone, not to call anyone, just to stand there for a moment, letting the quiet realization settle fully, that not everything valuable announces itself, that not everything important stands at the center of the room, and that sometimes the most significant influence on your life is something you almost overlooked entirely. He exhaled slowly, then began to walk. Not faster, not slower, just differently, because something had shifted, not in his position, not in his success, but in the way he saw the world, and that change, subtle as it was, would follow him long after the night ended, long after the restaurant closed, long after Clara Bennett finished her shift and disappeared once more into a life that did not require recognition to hold its value. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, Ethan Caldwell carried forward a truth he would not forget. That respect does not come from being seen first, it comes from finally learning how to see.